March 8:45. The monks at Saint-Germain-des-Prés wake to silence, the kind of silence that makes your stomach drop. No birds, no river sounds, just nothing. Then they see it. Sails, dozens of them, cutting through the morning fog like knives through silk. Longships, dragon-headed, already too close to run. You're standing on those monastery walls right now, your heart's hammering. You can hear it in your ears, and you're asking yourself one question. Do we fight? Do we negotiate? Do we pray? Here's what the Vikings are asking. Nothing. They don't need to ask, because they already know your answer. The Vikings could have negotiated. They were brilliant at it. They just found something faster than words. A reputation. Why talk for weeks when fear can get you paid in one night? This is the story of why Viking leaders preferred fear to negotiation. Not because they couldn't negotiate, they were masters at it, but because fear controlled negotiation, made it faster, bigger, more reliable. You think Vikings were just raiders? Wrong. They were strategic entrepreneurs of violence. Every burned village was an investment. Every massacre was a message. Every tribute payment was proof the system worked. And here's the twist you won't see coming. The most successful Vikings weren't the best fighters. They were the best deal makers. They just made sure you were terrified before the negotiation even started. Let me show you how the machine worked. Spring, 845. Paris, the most important city in the Frankish Empire. Walls that had stood for centuries. Thousands of soldiers, the capital of Christendom in the west, and a Viking fleet just sailed up the Seine like they owned it. Ragnar, that's the name in the chronicles. Ragnar Lothbrok, maybe. History gets fuzzy on the details. But what's crystal clear is what happened next. He didn't lay siege for months, didn't send diplomatic envoys, didn't ask for a parley, he just demonstrated. His warriors hit the suburbs, methodically, thoroughly, not in a rage, in a system. They burned what couldn't be moved, took what could, and made sure every survivor could run back to the city and describe exactly what they'd seen. Now you're King Charles. You're watching smoke rise from a dozen villages. You've got reports flooding in. Your advisors are screaming different things. Some want to fight, some want to pay, some want to pray. And here's your impossible choice. Fight, and maybe win, maybe lose everything, definitely lose thousands of men and months of time. Or pay, and they leave. Today, this week, the problem disappears like smoke. What do you do? Charles paid. 7,000 pounds of silver. The Vikings left. That's negotiation, just with a knife on the table. Here's what makes this brilliant. Ragnar didn't need to break through the walls. He didn't need to prove he could take Paris. He just needed to prove that trying to stop him would cost more than paying him. Fear made the math simple. And every ruler in Europe was watching. Every coastal town, every monastery with a treasury. They all learned the same lesson. Vikings can be bought off, but you have to pay. This is why Viking leaders preferred fear to negotiation, or rather, why they preferred fear-powered negotiation to the polite kind. Traditional diplomacy takes weeks, months, envoys traveling back and forth, proposals, counter-proposals, stalling, posturing. Fear cuts through all of it in one afternoon. Fast forward 40 years, same city, same river, different Vikings. November 885, Paris again. This time the Northmen came with an army. Not a raid, an invasion force, hundreds of ships, thousands of men. They wanted passage up the Seine to raid deeper into Frankish territory, and Paris was in the way. The city said no. The Vikings said, wrong answer. What followed was a siege that should have been impossible to survive, month after month. Winter came. Disease came. Starvation circled like a wolf. The Vikings built towers, threw everything they had at those walls, and Paris held. Barely. The defenders were dying on their feet, eating rats, burning furniture for warmth. Every day the situation got worse. Every day the odds dropped. Count Odo, the man holding the walls, was living through a nightmare that wouldn't end. Then spring came, and with it, Emperor Charles the Fat arrived with an army. Finally, reinforcements, the end of the siege. Except, Charles didn't attack. He negotiated, he paid the Vikings 700 livres of silver and gave them permission to sail upriver and raid Burgundy instead. Let that sink in. Paris survived the impossible, held out through a winter siege that should have crushed them, waited for rescue, and their rescue paid the Vikings to go bother someone else. Why? Because Charles did the math. Fighting meant casualties, uncertainty, months more of war. Paying meant the problem solved itself by Tuesday. The Vikings had turned fear into currency, and once you accept that currency, you're in their economy now. This wasn't random violence. This wasn't berserker rage. This was business. And the business model was unbeatable. Make one town pay, and 10 more will pay to avoid becoming an example. That's why Viking leaders preferred fear to negotiation. Because fear was negotiation with a guarantee. Fear was negotiation that couldn't be stalled, ignored, or gamed by diplomats playing for time. You can't negotiate with your own terror. Now let's talk about why this system existed in the first place. Here's what nobody tells you about Viking kings and jarls and war leaders. They weren't born into guaranteed power. A Viking chieftain's authority lasted exactly as long as he could keep his warriors happy. Rich, successful. The moment the loot dried up, the moment the victories stopped, his crew would find someone else to follow. This wasn't a kingdom with taxes and bureaucracy. This was a warrior band where loyalty was purchased with success. Every raid was a job. Every warrior expected his cut. Arm rings, silver, land, slaves, glory, the stuff that made you somebody back home. A leader who spent 3 months in polite diplomatic negotiations while his men sat in camp eating through supplies and getting bored. That's a leader who wakes up one morning to find half his fleet gone. But a leader who sails up a river, makes a town beg to pay him, and redistributes that silver to his crew within a week? That's a leader men will follow into hell. Fear made wealth arrive faster, and fast wealth made loyalty stronger. You see the system now? Violence wasn't the opposite of politics. Violence was politics. It was how you proved you were worth following. Here's the second problem with traditional negotiation. Time. Viking fleets operated on a clock, a brutal, unforgiving clock. Spring. Sail from Scandinavia. Summer. Raid season. Autumn. Sail home before the storms hit. Winter. Survive the dark months and plan next year. That's your window. Maybe 4 months, maybe 5 if you're lucky. Now imagine you're a Viking leader anchored off the coast of East Anglia. You've got 200 men, 30 ships, supplies for maybe 6 weeks if you're careful. Option 1. Send envoys, wait for a response, negotiate terms, go back and forth, maybe reach an agreement in a month, maybe 2. Maybe they're stalling until winter forces you to leave. Option 2. Burn a village, wait 3 days, watch the king's messenger arrive with bags of silver and a desperate offer. Which one makes sense when you can hear autumn coming? Viking leaders preferred fear to negotiation because fear respected the calendar. Polite diplomacy required time they didn't have. Fear created urgency that matched their operational reality. Every day spent negotiating was a day closer to the season ending, a day closer to storms, a day your crew spent eating supplies instead of taking treasure. Fear made. People decide now. But here's where it gets really elegant. From the Viking perspective, making people afraid was an investment. Think about it like this. You're a Frankish king. Vikings just hit 3 coastal monasteries, burned them flat. The survivors are spreading stories about the dragon ships and the warriors who fight like demons. Now you've got a choice. Build walls around every monastery, garrison every coastal town, maintain a standing fleet, train thousands of soldiers, keep them fed, paid, and ready year-round. Or keep a treasury ready. When the Vikings show up, you pay them. They leave. You rebuild. Life goes on. What's cheaper? The tribute. And the Vikings knew it. This is why England invented the Danegeld, an actual tax, a line item in the kingdom's budget specifically for paying Vikings to go away. Not because the English were cowards, because the math worked. Raising 5,000 pounds of silver was expensive. But it was less expensive than maintaining a military force capable of defeating every Viking fleet that might show up. Fear made defense too expensive, and tribute look rational. Once a kingdom pays once, it signals it will pay again. And every kingdom watching learns the same lesson. Resistance costs more than compliance. The Vikings had created a protection racket that spanned the entire North Sea. Now here's where the system becomes supernatural. Every time a town pays, the next town hears about it. Every time a city burns, chroniclers write it down. Every time warriors return home loaded with silver, they tell stories. And those stories spread. Within a generation, the reputation does half the work for you. You don't need to prove you're dangerous. Everyone already knows. The chroniclers, the monks writing everything down, they're terrified. Their accounts describe Vikings as unstoppable, inhuman, divine punishment for Christian sins. These aren't objective reports. These are trauma written in ink. And that terror spreads faster than any fleet. By the time your ships appear on the horizon, the town's already trying to calculate how much silver they have. The negotiations are happening before you drop anchor. This is why Viking leaders preferred fear to negotiation, because fear was self-replicating. Fear was compound interest. Every successful raid didn't just pay for itself. It made the next raid easier. Your reputation became a weapon that fought battles before you arrived. A Viking leader in 890 didn't need to be as fierce as one in 840. He just needed to remind people what Vikings had already done. The system was feeding itself. And here's the beautiful, terrible truth. The more successful the system became, the less violence was actually necessary. By the late 9th century, some Viking fleets were getting paid without ever drawing a sword. They'd just show up. The reputation did everything. Fear had become more valuable than the warriors themselves. But now we hit the twist, the moment where everything you think you know flips upside down. Because here's what the chronicles don't tell you. Vikings negotiated constantly. Treaties, trade agreements, hostage exchanges, marriage alliances, land grants, oaths of loyalty. They were in negotiations all the time. They just made sure they were negotiating from a position where no wasn't really an option. See, Viking leaders didn't prefer fear instead of negotiation. They preferred fear as the opening move in negotiation. There's a difference. Let me show you what real Viking diplomacy looked like. How deals were made real, so nobody cheats. The problem with any medieval agreement was enforcement. How do you make sure the other side keeps their word? There's no international court, no UN peacekeepers, no binding arbitration, just 2 groups of armed men who don't trust each other, trying to make a deal that might last longer than a summer. The Vikings solved this with a system that was absolutely brilliant. Hostages, not prisoners, hostages. There's a difference. You give me your son, I give you mine. Now we both have a reason not to break the treaty, because if I attack you, you kill my son. If you attack me, I kill yours. It's insurance written in blood. But it's more than that. Those hostages often got raised together. fostered in each other's courts. They learned each other's languages, customs, politics. They became real bonds between cultures. This wasn't crude. This was sophisticated diplomacy that made agreements enforceable. Oaths. Vikings took oaths seriously, not because they were more honest than anyone else, but because an oath-breaker lost their reputation. And in a society where your word was your credit rating, that was social death. So treaties got sworn. Publicly, with witnesses, often on holy objects. Christian kings would swear on relics. Vikings might swear on arm rings or sacred objects. Breaking that oath didn't just make you untrustworthy. It made you ritually cursed. Gifts and feasting. You can't underestimate this. When Viking and Frankish leaders made peace, they didn't just sign papers. They ate together, drank together, exchanged elaborate gifts. Why? Because gift-giving created obligation. If I give you a golden arm ring worth a year's tribute, you're now in my debt. Not legally, socially. You owe me honor. And honor was currency. These weren't symbolic gestures. These were the actual mechanisms that made medieval diplomacy work. Late 870s. Wessex, England. King Alfred is losing. The great heathen army has carved up 3 kingdoms already. Northumbria? Gone. East Anglia? Conquered. Mercia? Partitioned. Wessex is the last one standing, and it's barely standing at all. Guthrum, the Viking leader, has Alfred on the ropes. Hunted, hiding in the marshes of Somerset with a few dozen loyal men. This should be the end. The chronicles should stop here. Instead, Alfred does the impossible. He rallies, gathers an army from nothing, catches Guthrum off guard at Edington and wins, decisively, completely, drives the Viking army back to their fortress and lays siege. Now Guthrum is trapped, starving, beaten. And here's where it gets interesting. Alfred doesn't slaughter them, doesn't enslave them, doesn't even demand they leave England. He negotiates. But, and this is crucial, the negotiation happens after Alfred proved he could destroy them. Fear set the frame. Victory made Guthrum willing to accept terms. The terms? Guthrum converts to Christianity. Alfred himself stands as his godfather at the baptism. The Viking army withdraws from Wessex. They get to keep the territory they already control, the Danelaw, but they recognize boundaries. And hostages get exchanged to make sure nobody's lying. This is fear-powered negotiation at its finest. Alfred used his victory to force Guthrum to the table. Then he used ritual, baptism, godparenthood, oaths, to make the deal legitimate, enforceable, real. The baptism wasn't just symbolic. It made Guthrum Alfred's godson in Christian terms. Breaking the treaty now wasn't just oath-breaking, it was kin-breaking. The Vikings understood this system perfectly. They'd been using versions of it for generations. And we know this wasn't just propaganda because the actual treaty text survived. The Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum. It's not long, it's not flowery, it's specific. Boundaries are defined. The border runs along the River Lea, then up to Bedford, then along the Ouse. If you cross it, you're violating the treaty. Legal procedures for disputes between English and Danes. Compensation rates if someone gets killed. This isn't vague diplomatic language. This is a legally binding contract between 2 governments. Vikings didn't just raid and leave. When it served them, they negotiated like professionals. They just made sure fear had already done the heavy lifting before the negotiations started. But the ultimate example, the one that proves Vikings could negotiate at the highest level, happens in 911. Rollo, a Viking leader who'd been terrorizing the Seine Valley for years, raiding, burning, taking tribute, the usual playbook. The Frankish king, Charles the Simple, has a problem. He can't beat Rollo. He's tried, it hasn't worked. So he tries something else. He offers Rollo a deal, not go away, not here's tribute. Land. The territory around Rouen, the mouth of the Seine, some of the richest land in Francia. In exchange, Rollo converts to Christianity, swears loyalty to Charles, and, here's the kicker, defends Francia against other Vikings. You're turning the raiders into the guard dogs. Rollo looks at this deal, does the math, and says yes. He gets baptized, takes a Frankish name, marries a Frankish noblewoman, swears oaths, exchanges hostages, and just like that, the Viking raider becomes a Frankish duke. This is the birth of Normandy, named after the Northmen, the Vikings who stopped raiding and started ruling. And within 3 generations, Rollo's descendants are more French than Frankish. They've adopted the language, the customs, the religion. They build cathedrals. They write charters in Latin. But they keep the Viking edge, the military innovation, the ruthless efficiency. A century and a half later, Rollo's great-great-great-grandson, William, will use those skills to conquer England. But that's another story. The point is this. Rollo didn't stop being Viking when he started negotiating. He just recognized when negotiation offered more than raiding ever could. Land, legitimacy, a dynasty. You can't get that from a raid. But you can only get the offer if you're dangerous enough that making you an ally seems smarter than keeping you an enemy. Fear opened the door. Negotiation walked through it. Let's zoom in on hostages one more time, because this is where the system gets really sophisticated. Medieval Europe ran on personal relationships. Your word, your kin, your reputation. But how do you trust someone from a completely different culture? Someone who doesn't share your laws, your religion, your language? Hostages solved this. They were human collateral, living contracts. But here's what makes the Viking Age system special. Hostages weren't just locked in towers waiting to be killed if things went wrong. They were fostered, raised in the court of their captors, educated, trained. Sometimes they'd stay for years, form real friendships, learn the language perfectly, marry into families. By the time they went home, they were bridges between cultures. You can see this in the treaties, in the family networks that spread across Scandinavia and the British Isles and Francia. Noble families with branches in 3 kingdoms, all connected through fostered hostages who'd grown up together. This wasn't primitive. This was advanced diplomacy. And it worked precisely because everyone understood the stakes. Break your oath, and you're not just breaking a promise. You're condemning someone's son, someone's brother, maybe someone you've known since childhood. That's how you make a treaty stick when there's no police force to enforce it. The Vikings didn't invent this system, but they perfected it, used it across cultural boundaries that should have been impossible to bridge. And it all started with fear, making both sides willing to find a solution. So let's put it all together. Why did Viking leaders prefer fear to negotiation? They didn't. That's the wrong question. The right question is, why did Viking leaders use fear to control negotiation? And now you know the answer. 1. Fear made wealth arrive faster, and fast wealth kept warriors loyal. 2. Fear respected the calendar. Raiding seasons were short, and traditional diplomacy was slow. 3. Fear made tribute cheaper than defense, so payment became the rational choice. 4. Fear compounded. Every successful raid made the next one easier. But here's the final layer. 5. Fear forced the other side to negotiate seriously. When you're desperate, you don't play games. You don't stall. You don't send junior diplomats to waste time while you prepare your defenses. You send your best people. You come with real offers. You're ready to make concessions. Fear made negotiation honest. Think about Alfred and Guthrum. That treaty doesn't happen if Alfred hasn't just proven he can destroy the Viking army. Guthrum negotiates in good faith because he's terrified of the alternative. Think about Rollo. Charles doesn't offer him Normandy if Rollo is just a minor nuisance. He offers it because Rollo has made the Seine Valley ungovernable for a decade. Because fear makes the cost of buying him off look reasonable. Fear wasn't the opposite of negotiation. Fear was the tool that made negotiation work. And the Vikings understood this better than anyone in medieval Europe. Now watch what happens over the next century. The Vikings who keep raiding, most of them fade into history. Some glory, some silver, then nothing. But the Vikings who learn to negotiate after establishing fear, they become kings, rulers of England, founders of Normandy, princes of Kiev, the Varangian Guard in Constantinople, elite mercenaries so valuable the Byzantine emperors pay them fortunes. The most successful Vikings weren't the ones who rejected negotiation. They were the ones who understood that fear and negotiation weren't opposites. They were partners. You use fear to set the terms. Then you use negotiation to make those terms permanent. You use violence to get to the table. Then you use oaths, hostages, marriages, and rituals to make sure everyone stays at the table. That's the real Viking strategy. And it's why their influence didn't end when the raids stopped. It's why Scandinavian kingdoms became integrated into medieval European politics. Why Viking descendants ruled in places their grandparents had once raided. They turned fear into respect. Respect into legitimacy. Legitimacy into dynasties. So here's the final truth. The one that changes everything. Vikings didn't replace negotiation with violence. They replaced weak negotiation with fear-powered negotiation. Because here's what medieval Europe looked like before the Vikings forced everyone to adapt. Negotiations that dragged on for years, envoys traveling back and forth with letters, kings making promises they never intended to keep, treaties that dissolved the moment one side saw an advantage. It was all words, all posturing, all theater. The Vikings cut through it like an axe through ice. They said, "Here's what we want. Here's what happens if you refuse. Decide now." And suddenly, negotiation got real. Suddenly, promises had to be backed by hostages. Oaths had to be sworn in public with witnesses. Treaties had to include enforcement mechanisms that actually worked. The Vikings didn't destroy medieval diplomacy. They forced it to evolve. Every kingdom that survived the Viking Age came out of it with better fortifications, better navies, better administrative systems, and better diplomatic protocols. England unified under pressure from Viking invasion. Before the Vikings, it was 7 squabbling kingdoms. After, one nation, forged in the fire of survival. Francia reorganized its defenses and created new feudal structures. The entire system of local lords with military obligations. That's partly a response to Viking raids. You need someone who can raise warriors fast when dragon ships appear. The whole diplomatic language of medieval Europe, hostage exchange, ritual oaths, formalized peace processes, got refined through constant interaction with Vikings who demanded negotiations that actually meant something. Fear taught Europe how to negotiate honestly. And here's the beautiful irony. The descendants of those terrifying raiders? They became some of medieval Europe's most sophisticated diplomats. Norman lords negotiating papal politics with the subtlety of chess, masters. Scandinavian kings arranging dynastic marriages across a dozen kingdoms, weaving webs of alliance that would make Machiavelli jealous. The Varangians in Constantinople, serving as the personal guard to emperors while maintaining trade networks that stretched from Baghdad to Iceland. These weren't just warriors anymore. They were political operators. Within 2 centuries, Vikings went from being Europe's nightmare to being woven into the fabric of European nobility. How? Because they understood something fundamental. Fear gets you to the table, but only negotiation keeps you there. The transformation. Think about what that means. A Viking leader in 845 has one playbook: raid, terrify, extract tribute, leave. Simple, effective, profitable, but limited. A Viking leader in 945? He's playing a completely different game. He's negotiating trade agreements, managing territorial boundaries, mediating disputes between rival lords, hosting diplomatic feasts, where the wine flows and the alliances form. He still has the longships, still has the warriors, still has that edge of danger that makes everyone remember what Northmen can do. But now those are tools in a larger strategy. The reputation his grandfather built with blood? He's spending it like currency, trading on it, using it to open doors, secure deals, win concessions. And when he needs to remind someone why breaking a treaty with Northmen is a bad idea, he doesn't need to burn a village. He just needs to look at them a certain way. Let the silence stretch. Let them remember the stories. The fear does the work without him having to do the violence. That's the ultimate evolution of the system. You build the reputation with terror. Then you maintain it with the threat of terror. And eventually you barely need to threaten at all. Everyone just knows. The human cost. But let's not romanticize this. Behind every successful negotiation was a village that burned. Behind every peaceful treaty was a massacre that made peace seem preferable. The system worked because people were terrified of the alternative. Those monks at Saint-Germain-des-Prés, watching the longships come through the fog, some of them died that day, screaming, begging, their treasuries looted, their lives ended, their deaths used as object lessons for the next town. The defenders of Paris, starving through that winter siege, they watched friends die, children die, ate things they never thought they'd eat, endured the impossible because surrender seemed worse, until surrender became the only option left. The hostages exchanged to guarantee treaties. Some of them never saw home again, died in foreign courts, became bargaining chips in games they didn't choose to play. This wasn't bloodless. The Vikings preferred fear to negotiation because fear worked, because violence delivered results, because the alternative, slow, careful, patient diplomacy, didn't pay the warriors who kept you in power. The system was brilliant. It was also built on bones. Final image, extended. Picture this. A longship beach on the coast of Normandy, 940-something, late summer. An old warrior, maybe 60, which is ancient for his time, stands watching the sunset. His name was probably Scandinavian once, but now everyone calls him by his French title. His grandson speaks better Latin than Norse, goes to Mass every Sunday, wants to be a bishop, not a raider. The old man doesn't know whether to be proud or sad about that. He's watching the same kind of longships his grandfather sailed. But these aren't raiders. They're traders, carrying furs from the north, silver from the east, wine from the south, protected by treaties he helped negotiate, stopping at ports where harbor masters know them by name. The dragonhead prows are still there. The warriors are still aboard, but now they're insurance, not invasion. The fear is still there, sleeping beneath the surface. Everyone remembers what happens when you break a treaty with Northmen. But as long as the agreements hold, as long as the oaths stay sworn, and the hostages stay safe, and the tribute keeps flowing both directions, the ships keep sailing, the trade keeps moving, the peace keeps holding. The old warrior touches the scar on his arm, from a battle 40 years ago. A battle he won because the enemy broke and ran before the real fighting started. Because they'd heard the stories. Because fear did half the work. He wonders sometimes, did they fight because they wanted to, or because they had to? Did they prefer fear, or did they just understand it was the fastest path to what they needed? He doesn't have an answer. But he knows this. His grandson will never need to find out. That's the real Viking legacy. Not the raids, not the violence. The understanding that fear and diplomacy aren't opposites, they're tools. And the smartest leaders know when to use each one. The Vikings who figured that out didn't just survive. They thrived. They built kingdoms that lasted centuries, dynasties that shaped European history, networks that connected continents. All because they understood one simple truth. Fear opens doors that polite words never could. But once you're inside, you'd better know how to negotiate, because fear gets you one payment, one treaty, one season. But negotiation, real negotiation, backed by the memory of what happens when you're not reasonable, that gets you a kingdom. That gets you legitimacy. That gets you a place in history that's more than just a cautionary tale. The final reversal. And here's the twist nobody expects. The Vikings didn't win by being the most violent civilization in Europe. Medieval Europe was drowning in violence. Every kingdom was at war with its neighbors. Every lord was raiding someone. It was constant, grinding, endless warfare. The Vikings won by being the most strategic about their violence. They didn't fight for glory or honor or religion. They fought for leverage. They didn't raid for vengeance. They raided for profit. They didn't negotiate from weakness. They negotiated from a position where saying no cost more than saying yes. They turned violence into a business model. And then they turned that business model into kingdoms. That's why we remember them. Not because they were the cruelest, not because they were the strongest, because they were the smartest about converting fear into power and power into legitimacy. They hacked the system. And then they became the system. So what happened when a town refused? When someone called the Viking bluff? When the system of fear met actual resistance that wouldn't break? That's where things got really interesting, because the Vikings had backup plans, psychological warfare techniques that would make modern special forces take notes. Next time, we're diving into the exact tricks Vikings used to make a town surrender before the first arrow flew. The mind games, the theater, the calculated demonstrations of power designed to break your will without breaking down your walls. How do you make an entire city lose hope? How do you turn brave defenders into people begging to negotiate? The Vikings knew. They had it down to a science. And what they knew changed warfare forever. Hit subscribe, hit the bell. Because this story isn't over. We've seen why Viking leaders preferred fear to negotiation. Next, we're seeing how they weaponized that fear. How they got inside people's heads and made them defeat themselves. It's darker than you think. It's smarter than you'd believe. And it worked almost every single time.